The American cruiser force was involved in some of the thickest fighting of the Pacific War from start to finish. Both light and heavy cruisers would suffer heavily for this, with many of the pre-war ships either sunk outright or heavily damaged. In today's video, we'll be looking at one of the latter, a ship that despite severe damage would survive the war, while being the rare case of a Brooklyn-class ship not sent to South America, with the ship in question being USS Honolulu. She would fight the Pacific War from the very start, moored at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. And despite some serious damage at various points, she remained active for most of the war, ultimately earning 8 battle stars for her service in some of the most notable surface actions of the conflict, something that no one probably expected when she was first laid down. USS Honolulu's story began on December 9, 1935 in the New York Navy Yard. Her keel was laid down on that day, with construction progressing at a typical peacetime pace. The cruiser was launched on August 26, 1937, and commissioned on June 15, 1938. Honolulu would depart on her shakedown cruise soon after her commissioning. This saw her venture all the way to Britain, which was admittedly fairly long for a shakedown, although it wouldn't take her long to return home. Honolulu would remain based on the East Coast for her early service, consisting of training and working up, as well as working out any kinks in the ship, though this wasn't as important as it could have been. This ship was part of what was, by this point, a mature design. Honolulu was, after all, one of the last Brooklyn-class cruisers. Actually, the last of the class, if you consider St. Louis and Helena to be a subclass, or even a fully distinct design of their own, which is a good point to talk about Honolulu's design before we move on. Honolulu displaced around 9,900 tons on her standard loading, just under the 10,000-ton Washington Treaty limit, with the full load going up to around 12,400 tons. On that displacement, Honolulu carried no fewer than 15 6-inch or 152mm guns, and 5 3-gun turrets, all on the centerline. One super-firing pair on the bow, with the third turret carried on the same level as the first, and the second super-firing between the other two, with a more traditional super-firing pair on the stern to round things off. The secondary battery, meanwhile, consisted of 8 5-inch 25 caliber dual-purpose guns. These were carried in single open mountings, with one pair on either side of the bridge, and the remaining 6 carried alongside the funnels, as you can see here. Now, for dedicated anti-aircraft weaponry, this varied drastically depending on what time you're looking at. As designed, it was 8 50 caliber machine guns. This would have been reinforced by 20mm cannon and 40mm Bofors as those became available. Exact numbers, of course, varying between ships and time period. I'll touch on Honolulu's final loadout towards the end of the video, because it's directly relevant to her final refit. In any event, the ship didn't carry any torpedoes. She did, however, carry 4 floatplanes with 2 stern catapults. As for armor protection, that consisted of a 5-inch 127mm thick main belt, with deck armor of 2 inches or 51mm for its part. All of this could reach around 32.5 knots on 100,000 shaft horsepower, through 4 shafts. Not the fastest cruisers out there, but not slow either. Regardless, that finishes off the design details for now. So let's go back to where we left off on service history. Although there's not much to cover here, before the war broke out, Honolulu would transfer from her East Coast training to the Pacific on May 24, 1939. Arriving in California on June 14th. She would also visit Pearl Harbor during the same year, receiving a silver punch bowl and 48 silver cups as a present from the territory of Hawaii. Still, this wouldn't change much in terms of service. Honolulu would continue training and participating in fleet exercises, just in a different ocean. This would remain her duty through the rest of 1939, all of 1940, and the vast majority of 1941, with the only real change being, well, another relocation. The cruiser shifted to Pearl Harbor on November 5th, 1940. Either way, Honolulu's story only really changed at the end of 1941, as it did for many ships with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Even in this attack, however, the cruiser had relatively little to do. Honolulu wasn't a particularly important target to the Japanese. The only damage she suffered came in a near miss from a dive bomber. This caused some damage to the hull beneath the waterline, but nothing serious. Or at least a near miss generally assigned to a dive bomber. The damage report notes the hole in the concrete pier where the bomb hit was about 15 inches in diameter, speculating that it might have been caused by a modified 16-inch shell, which would imply a bomb from the level bombers carrying those modified shells. Regardless of what kind of bomb and bomber did the damage, it wasn't major enough to keep her in dock long. Honolulu would be escorting convoys by January 12, 1942. Specifically a convoy to San Francisco, arriving there on January 21st, before leaving again on the 31st to escort a convoy to Australia. For the next 4 months, the cruiser would be occupied on various convoy escorts. This would only change at the end of May 1942. Honolulu was sent to the Aleutian Islands on May 29th to reinforce American positions, where Honolulu would spend 2 months on patrol duty from the end of May until the start of August 1942, with this only changing on August 7th when the cruiser finally got to put her main battery to use. She sailed for Kiska Island, bombarding the Japanese forces on that island. Not exactly the most exciting thing, but it was something. The same can't be said for her next action on August 21st. Honolulu covered American landings on Adak Island to build up an airstrip on that isolated piece of land. As the Japanese had no forces there, this was pretty uneventful. You could say that for Honolulu's wartime service in general up to this point. That would, however, change soon enough. The cruiser finally left the freezing Alaskan waters for California on September 20th, 1942, for a refit period at the Mare Island shipyard. This would conclude by November, with Honolulu sailing for another convoy escort run on November 3rd, this time to New Caledonia, as the Guadalcanal campaign was in full swing. As you could probably expect, this would soon draw Honolulu in as well. She joined up with 4 other cruisers on November 24th, 1942, along with 6 destroyers for escort. This force would be the one that fought the next major naval battle off Guadalcanal on November 30th. the Battle of Tassafaronga, one of the worst American defeats of the Pacific War alongside Savo Island, an action that began as an attempt to intercept one of the Japanese Tokyo Express supply runs. The Japanese sent 8 destroyers down the slot, 6 carrying supplies with 2 escorts. The American force, with 6 destroyers and 5 cruisers, should have had the advantage. However, that would not be the case. The Japanese destroyers, under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, would savage the American forces under Rear Admiral Carleton Wright. 3 of the heavy cruisers suffered severe damage from long lance torpedoes. Minneapolis had her bow nearly severed ahead of the forward turret. New Orleans had everything ahead of the second turret blown off by a magazine explosion. Pensacola, meanwhile, suffered a hit further aft that ripped away her outer port shaft, while Northampton would take 2 torpedo hits, crippling the cruiser. She would ultimately be abandoned as damage control efforts failed to keep her afloat. Only Honolulu escaped damage, continuing to live a charmed life. She avoided the Japanese torpedoes and fired on the retreating destroyers, although she failed to deal any damage. Only 1 destroyer, Takanami, was sunk in the action. In the aftermath of the battle, Honolulu spent December in port before returning with a second cruiser task force on January 2, 1943. This would see her spend early 1943 on more quiet patrol duty, trying to engage any further Tokyo Express runs. This would come to nothing, with the only combat of note coming in shore bombardment, such as the Kula Gulf area on May 13, 1943, an area she would return to on July 4th to cover landings. For the next couple days, American and Japanese forces would trade fire. USS Strong was sunk on July 5th, most likely by a torpedo from the destroyer Nizuki. The next night, July 6th, would see the Battle of Kula Gulf. Honolulu would join with USS St. Louis and USS Helena in engaging the Japanese. They would sink Nizuki in this battle and damage the destroyer Nagatsuki to the point of beaching. Honolulu was the one to deal the fatal blow there, wrecking the destroyer's engine room. However, this came at the cost of Helena. Her bow was blown off, and 2 more torpedoes finished the ship off. Honolulu continued her lucky streak and avoided any damage in turn. Unfortunately, that luck would run out a few days later. On July 12th, the cruiser continued to patrol the Solomons, this time off the island of Kolombangara. Once again, Honolulu would engage the Japanese, except this time she would not escape damage. Honolulu, St. Louis, and the New Zealand cruiser Leander formed the core of the Allied task force. Joined by 10 destroyers, they faced off against a Japanese force of 1 old cruiser, 5 destroyers, and 4 more destroyers operating as transports. In the resulting battle, Honolulu and St. Louis would cripple the Japanese cruiser Jinsu, with that ship finished off by destroyer torpedoes. However, the Japanese struck back with their own torpedoes. All 3 Allied cruisers were hit, Leander so badly that she was out of the war. St. Louis suffered relatively minimal bow damage by comparison. Honolulu, meanwhile, experienced the pre-war American cruiser thing, her bow collapsing from a torpedo hit. She also suffered a dud to the stern. Repairs for this damage would last until November 17th, after temporary repairs in theater and later at Pearl Harbor, with the ship returning to the Solomons to round out 1943 on more patrol and bombardment duty. 1944, meanwhile, began fairly quietly. Honolulu would support various operations, at first remaining in the Solomons. But by June, she was supporting the invasion of the Marianas, covering the landings while supplying gunfire support for a couple months, before leaving that area by September to cover the landings on Peleliu, fairly typical for an American cruiser. However, the ship wouldn't do much after this point. Honolulu was shifted to cover the invasion of the Philippines on October 12, 1944. This would see her bombard Leyte and cover the landings on October 19th, only for a Japanese torpedo bomber to attack her on October 20th, 1944. This plane landed its fish, taking Honolulu out of the war, because the Navy decided against simply repairing the cruiser when she arrived in Norfolk on December 20th. They took the chance to bring her more in line with St. Louis and the lost Helena, at least in regard to weaponry. She received 8 5-inch .38 caliber guns in 4 twin mounts, along with 4 quadruple and 2 twin 40mm Bofors mounts for 20 barrels in all, with 18 20mm cannon rounding things off. Unfortunately, finding pictures of the ship in this refit is difficult. The only reason I'm confident in saying it did happen is because the ship's own war diary brings it up, which is a very firm source to say the least. Regardless, Honolulu would come out of refit in October 1945 for training ship duty. She was decommissioned on February 3, 1947, and put in reserve, where she would remain until being scrapped in late 1960. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.